long-winded, running through this life like it was mine. Never settling, but setting every goal high. 1,000 burpees on the path to my own destruction or success. But what is a mistake without the lesson? See, the best teacher in life is your own experience. None of us know who we are until we fail. They say every man is defined by his reaction to any given situation. Well, who would you want to define you? Someone else or yourself?
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Sounding Black podcast with Till and Will. Today, we wanted to take a little bit of time to discuss exactly what's transpired over the past week or so. Now, we have taken a couple weeks off, and this past week, I think it was important for us to really take some time because we, as a community, we're just grappling with a bunch of different things and just really just taking the time to breathe in a sense. For those who don't know, on Sunday, March 31st, we lost a philanthropist, entrepreneur, and artist by the name of Nipsey Hussle. And so for those who are not familiar with Nipsey, we wanted to take some time to talk about the type of person that we lost. And we wanted to take some time to really talk about what we can do from here. And I think it's again one of those topics that's it's touchy. It's something that, as a community, it allows us to open the door to really have a discussion about where we are and what we need to do moving forward. But again, to begin this conversation, I just really want to talk about the type of person that Nipsey was. And as we covered just a second ago, we lost a philanthropist, we lost an entrepreneur, we lost an artist, but he was doing so much for our community. And with that, let me kick it over to Will really quick, because I know he wanted to hop in and kind of talk about this a little bit. But man, as I sit here and sort of think about it, I'm just kind of like thrown off a little bit because it's so fresh. And I think, over the past week, it's been so fresh on my mind. For a couple of days, I couldn't sleep. And I was just really thinking about it and, constantly trying to deal with this idea that we lost somebody that we needed. And it's just been tough over the past week or so.
Yeah, and so for those that don't know, there's a sizable age gap between me and Till. I know you can't tell when you look at us, but all jokes aside, there is a bit of a generation gap. So I'm ashamed to admit it, but I will admit that, to be honest with you, I really did not know much about Nipsey prior to his passing. And it's one of those things that for me, when he passed, I had to go back in time to see who he was, what he was doing, and, even from a musical standpoint, just to kind of get a better glimpse. So I was definitely less familiar with him, but with everything I came across, two things kind of came to my mind. One being, how did I miss this? Like, why would somebody doing all of these amazing things seem to fly under the radar? Is it just that I'm old and I'm not around? Like, I don't know. Like, I couldn't pick my finger on why I didn't know all these things were happening. But outside of that, the other thing was, the more I learned, like, my appreciation and my admiration grew, because he's exactly the kind of person that I would always speak to my friends about. We need more of this. We need more people to do things like this. Mm-hmm. Not realizing that we had somebody doing these things. So one of the things that I always wondered is, was it just my ignorance, or was this just something that just wasn't being promoted as much as it should have been? And if so, why is it that when we have these young individuals doing these amazing things, we don't really hear about it?
Yep.
Now, had he picked up a charge, had he said something controversial about a particular group, he would have been a household name just like that.
Right.
But with all this positivity, he wasn't household, at least for me.
And the interesting part is Nipsey's from LA.
Yeah,
like
it just makes me feel worse.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, like, he's doing these things within the community here. So this idea that we don't promote this is a reality.
Well, let me ask it this way. I mean, for you, because I just don't know if I'm just not in the loop, or am I onto something in the sense that he wasn't really promoted in a way that he should have been, given everything that he did.
Right. And if you listen to any of his interviews, what he talks about is a lot different than what you would typically hear people talking about when you expect, even as an outsider, what you'd hear from a hip-hop artist.
Yeah.
And actually, when I was initially introduced to Nipsey, it was based on obviously his music, but in addition to that, I was sent an interview he did when he was just coming up. And basically he was talking about how his goal isn't to be the rapper that's around here with all these chains and different stuff like that.
Right.
He wanted to have assets, not liabilities. And so the mind of this man just speaks to the kind of man that he was, and he literally did everything to sort of promote that, whether people listened or not. And unfortunately, many people missed out on that. And as a result of what has transpired over the past week, more people are seeing it.
But here's what's funny to me, because I made that comment about there being a generation gap and what have you, and me not knowing. But oddly enough, I know of, who was this, Young Thug, you know? Mm-hmm. Definitely not a representation that I want.
Right.
Like, I don't want him to be a representative of black people. But I know of his music. I've heard his music. Mm-hmm. This Lil Pump character, like guys like that. Like, why do I know about these guys and not this person who, if I knew about him, even if I didn't like his music, I would have been willing to listen to and support because of what he was doing. I was like, that's the kind of guy that I want to listen to. That's the kind of guy I want to support. That's the kind of guy I want to promote. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. It kind of goes to that saying, like, if we're out there clowning and acting a fool, then you somehow make it to the forefront.
Right.
And if you're doing stuff that's important, that is life-changing, then it's a little harder to be mainstream. And again, I don't know whether he would be considered mainstream or not.
Right.
I'll leave that to y'all.
and just speaking about again the type of person that we lost. Like, when Nipsey was younger, one of the things that he and his brother did, like, they sold T-shirts and socks in front of a store, which positioned them later on to open the Marathon clothing store. They bought the building of a place that they were told when they were younger they basically weren't welcome. They used to have to get their food and leave. The guy who was the business owner in this particular case basically had tables that were set up at one point, and he took the tables away because he didn't want people hanging around there. So Nipsey, later on in life, bought that whole area, and the dude started to happen to pay rent to him, which I thought was like one of the coolest ways to sort of get back at this the character who, told him he wasn't welcome. And part of, like, the kind of person that Nipsey was, like, of course he was an artist, but he just had this business mentality in terms of just everything he did in terms of being an entrepreneur. So he continued to buy property within his community. He employed people from the community. Yeah. He gave people opportunities who wouldn't have seen opportunity likely anywhere else. So he hired people who had felony charges because he wanted to build something. He wanted to create wealth and prosperity within his community with people that looked like him, with people that he knew, with people that he came up with, in order to do something different. So every part of his life, and we'll sort of touch on that a little bit, was about just him being business minded. So yes, we saw the artist, but to that point, when he did the Crenshaw album, which was 2013, he sold 1,000 copies for $100. The reason he did that,
$100 each.
Exactly, 1,000 copies for $100 each. The reason he did that is he understands business, and he understood that if he streamed had 1 million streams, then it only equates to this amount of money. But since, again, getting back to this idea of him being a business-minded person, he owned all of his own masters. Right. So if I can sell these 1,000 copies for $100 each, I make $100,000.
Right.
And later on, when you do mailbox money, he sold copies for $1,000 each. So this dude, like, he was really, really smart, really intelligent. And the steps that he was taking as he furthered his career was just, it's unfortunate that we didn't appreciate it at the right time when he was here. And now that, you know, he's passed, it gives people an opportunity to obviously appreciate it, but you sort of have a roadmap for the type of people that we need to promote.
Right.
And we need to take advantage of that right now.
Well, so here's what's interesting and what I'd like to see. So, you know, for me, this takes me back like to when Tupac passed away, because that was my era. And when he passed away, it was one of those things where you wondered if that was just going to be it. He died, you mourned, you moved on. But as you know, people who weren't even alive when he was putting out music still seem to revere him in a certain way.
Right.
And legends usually just grow bigger and stronger, you know? So whatever you are today, if you're appreciated, you're going to be appreciated even greater further in time. So with Tupac's legend, it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, what I'm curious to see is with the legend that is Nipsey, will that continue to grow and get greater and greater and be something that, you know, lives well beyond his years,
Right.
to future generations, people who weren't even born during his time, kids that are going to be born 5-10 years from now, will they look back on Nipsey the same way? Because I think for the difference being with Tupac, it was, not that he didn't physically do anything, he did a lot, but a lot of it was music. So you could always go back and rely on the music. Kids were going back and relying on the music. Nipsey's music was influential, but the things that he did in the community were the greater things.
Right.
And those are the things, to me, that in order for those to live well beyond him, the story has to keep being pushed and passed down. Like, it has to keep being promoted and promoted. And I wonder if we're going to be able to do that, especially given this current generation where everything's a headline and then it dies quickly as we move on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing.
Right.
And I'd hate to see his legacy come and go as just a trend, like most things that happen in society these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think part of it is with Nipsey, if you listen to, like I was stating earlier, if you listen to his interviews, he's dropping knowledge in each one of his interviews.
Right. Yeah.
So you can go back and just sort of reference those things, sort of the way we reference Tupac's music in some of Tupac's interviews.
Right, exactly.
In one of our previous podcasts, we talked about Tupac saying he may not change the world, but he will inspire the mind that does.
Right.
And in one of Nipsey's songs, he literally said, "I'm the Tupac of my generation."
Yeah.
So you have to, again, appreciate those kinds of people when they're around. But I think we have a responsibility as people to sort of further their legacies and honor their legacies by promoting and doing exactly what they believed in. And Nipsey always preached about ownership.
Right.
He always preached about everything that we needed to do to sort of advance the community. So most people don't know that the Marathon store is like one of the first smart stores. And what
Explain that for those people who don't know.
So basically, as a smart store, the idea is you come in, you make your purchase, and then, of course, as a result of that, because of the connectivity there, you have an opportunity to listen to exclusive things that are from Nipsey. And so you're getting access immediately as part of your purchase and, you know, the things that you're doing within the store to exclusive content.
Right.
And so this guy's no stranger to just this idea of doing something different and promoting something different. I think with every step that he made, there was a reason for that. And like the unfortunate part is even within all of this, he was at that location because he was trying to help somebody. He was giving a friend, the story goes, he was giving a friend clothes who had just gotten out of prison. And so even in the midst of all of this, he was doing something unselfish. And I think that's just speaks to the kind of person that we lost. And to me, like, the unfortunate part is the way people sort of responded to it was, on one side, there's those people who are like, well, no, there's this conspiracy theory. And then on another side of it, there's people who are connecting this idea that, oh, he was a gangbanger, so to what we talked about earlier, you live by the gun, you die by the gun.
Right, and those aren't our words, by the way. Like,
right.
People have actually said that.
Like, literally said that. And, there's so many different responses, but to me...
I was going to say, let's jump into some of those. I mean,
right,
so we can talk about, because that's, I mean, I think that's important for us to harp on a bit.
For sure.
Like that first one when they were saying that it's some sort of conspiracy to take him down. And there were even comparisons to Dr. Sebi and what have you. Mm-hmm. And I know when I first read it, like, oh, conspiracy. And I'm thinking to myself, well, what exactly did he do that people would want to take him out? Because again, at that point, I'm ignorant. I didn't know. Now I'm not of the mindset that there was a conspiracy to take him down, but I think the bigger question is when we have these scenarios like this, like, we recognize that people are not excited to find out that people like Nipsey are around doing the things that he's doing and potentially teaching others. Because if you think about it let's just take sports out the picture and just roll with entertainment. That is not an industry that has been traditionally a black industry. So when it came to music, even if you go back and look at, what was it, Straight Outta Compton, and you saw what happened to those boys, like, everybody eats off of the talents of these individuals because they are the ones that have the connections and the ability to open the doors. And so many of these artists that we find out go broke overnight despite putting out all this content. You just assume, like, man, they must be killing it. They must be killing it. And we find out later they're not. Nipsey had a different plan in mind. Like, he had something that actually allowed him to be the beneficiary of his hard work. Right. And essentially his family to be the beneficiary of his hard work, down the line. And even the community. And I think what we'll do is sort of, to that point, is just let you guys hear part of Nipsey's wasn't an interview. He was at this event. I assume it was a summit of some sort. But he was talking about this idea that people want to benefit from hip hop. People want to benefit from your talents. Right. And so this idea that you need to be able to take advantage of that. The people who are actually the artists, the people who actually have the talent, it goes beyond having alcohol and promoting somebody else's business. It goes beyond, like, doing T-shirts. That's part of the reason why Nipsey wanted to do the store in the first place. Like, that idea of ownership and then taking advantage of your talents and, promoting that in a way. I'm sorry I cut you off. No, it's okay. I mean, I think that's an excellent point. But I think that's the scary part to people, because when you look at all of the money that comes from the popularity of the hip hop culture, if it all starts going, or a majority of it starts to go to the artists, there's going to be a lot of people whose lifestyles change. Mm-hmm. For sure. A lot of mortgages that aren't getting paid, a lot of college tuitions that aren't being paid. There's a lot. It's a major change. Right. So even though I didn't fall into that idea of it was a conspiracy to take him out, I understood the basis for that theory. For sure. For sure, because you, as a person, you want to... You don't want to believe that somebody would be that malicious, that jealous, that envious to take out a person who's doing so much for the community. And you believe that because somebody like that is doing so much, that there has to be more to it. And honestly, like, for me, it crossed my mind. Like, first thing, I'm like, well, Nipsey was doing this, and that. So
you're giving them a reason, or this idea that there's a reason
to silence him, basically.
To silence him.
Yeah.
It has to cross your mind because we have historical
evidence. It's happened before.
Exactly.
It's not like we can't say it hasn't happened.
Right. So this idea that there's a conspiracy, you have reason to reference that, and of course if there's evidence that this has happened before, it's going to happen again. So of course it's going to cross your mind that will be one of the reasons. And then of course this idea of gang violence. Yeah, Nipsey had a past life where he was rolling 60s. Yeah. And like people know that. That's like one of the things that he talked about. But his life went so much further beyond that. Everything that we've talked about that he's done, everything we've talked about that he was working to do, the kind of person that we lost is not somebody that you want to miss out on while they're here. And I always, as I've been talking about this, I've been just reminding people that yes, the world lost a good man. The world lost a great man, I should say. But somebody lost a mentor. Somebody lost a father. Somebody lost a loved one. Like, we have to, in talking about this in the way we're dealing with this as a community, as a society, we have to be reminded of that, and also be cautious that we're not we're not promoting the negativity when we deal with having discussions about this. Because if you're gonna use this as an opportunity to say, hey, gangs, whatever, and that's not the actual truth behind the reason why this happened, then you're furthering a negative agenda. In my mind.
No, I agree. And I think the other interesting part, man, my lady had sent me what was it? It was a video of Nipsey and Lauren London just interacting. Mm-hmm. Right? I guess they were doing this back and forth about what he liked. I mean, how much he knew about her. Right. And, just watching it, like he didn't have that bullshit approach to treating, like the way he treated her. Like he knew about it. Like he knew who she was. You could tell he was in tune. He cared about his family. He cared about, his wife. And I'd seen another clip. I think he was on a red carpet with her. Mm-hmm. And he had talked about how lucky he was to have her. And you just don't see stuff like that anymore because everything is like this bitch, that bitch, this hoe, that hoe, mm-hmm. twerk here, twerk there. Like, I mean, that's y'all, man. That's your generation.
That's actually like a song.
But can we get that recorded?
Right.
But I mean, the crazy part about it is just like he just seemed to be so outside of the box, and it's crazy because the stuff that he did is unique, and it should be celebrated. Mm-hmm. But the flip side of it, and I think the part that maybe bothers me the most, is that it should not be unique. And that is probably the bigger takeaway from this. Yeah. Because everything he's saying, part of the reason that we gravitate toward is because it's different. But it really shouldn't be. Like ownership, like investment, family, marriage, like those are things that, I mean, they really should just be a norm.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with that, and I posted something the other day. Is what really bothered me about this whole situation is everything that Nipsey was doing mm-hmm. are things that I've said I wanted to do my entire life, like basically own within my own community and help people learn and grow. So this idea that we should be teaching people from our community, this idea that we should be building wealth and prosperity within our own community, because oftentimes we're not exposed to things like that. Yeah. And I believe, obviously, that's the reason why it's unique in that sense, because of this idea of exposure. And with that in mind, I think that allows us to sort of transition into what we wanted to talk about next is, like, do people who make it out, or what is considered making it out, have an obligation to give back? And if so, what is that obligation?
Man, that's honestly, that to me is a very difficult and, well, it's hard to say, right? Because the idea is, for most people, you want to give back, right? You always want to give back to those who have helped you, who helped make you into who you are. And if you grew up in the neighborhood, especially like on the West Coast, it's a lot of the inner city neighborhoods are all the same to me. I mean, I've been to multiple ones. I lived in multiple ones. They don't change. Maybe the colors change, the demographics change a bit, but it's the same shit. Like it really is. It does not change much. And so what happens is there's a part of you that sees something that you know isn't right. And there's a part of you that appreciates the person that it turned you into,
right? Because
it does make you feel like you can take and handle anything. So that when you start running into these other challenges, once you start to get away, when you start to move on into other areas of life and get around different people and you start finding these new challenges, those challenges pale in comparison to the challenges that you dealt with to even get to a point to be in these classrooms or in these boardrooms or wherever you might be. So I think there's always going to be this feeling and this obligation to being able to give back.
Right.
But I think from there we have this conversation of what do you give back, how do you give back, and really do you, depending on what you do, how do you continue to advance your own life,
right,
while still trying to help people who aren't quite where you are and may or may not really see themselves getting to where you are, or might look at you as, well, yeah, it might have worked for you, but I don't see it happening for me.
Right.
So there's like so many challenges, I think, that come along with it. But I do think that there's an obligation because there are resources there. There are people there that help steer you in a way that made you different.
Right.
And your outcome in your life different than other people who grew up in that set of circumstances.
I mean, I think this is sort of a loaded question in many ways. Reason I say that is obviously we live in a capitalist society.
Yes.
So, of course, there exists this idea, if I make it out, the only obligation I have is to myself. I did it. So people tend to believe that when you make it out, you're special.
Right.
I tell people all the time, fear kept me out of more bad situations than being smart did.
Yeah.
It wasn't that I was any smarter than people.
Yeah.
It wasn't that I just had this idea that if I do this, then I can have that. Like, yeah, that's part of it. But in many situations, I didn't want to come home to get beat. I didn't want to put myself in a position where I had to fight people or do certain things or, put myself in a situation where I was going to be harmed in any way. And so, I mean, later on down the line, that's how I ended up playing football because I wanted to tell myself that I was stronger. I could fight and do different things of that nature. But for me, it was not that I was any smarter, not that I was any more special. I had a certain fear that if I did this, this is the path that I was going to end up. But with that said, I believe there's also that part to what your point was a second ago is I'm still a product of my environment. Right. And I think oftentimes we have a negative connotation when we say that. But there's so many things that my environment taught me that I utilize today when it comes to the way I engage with people. Right. When it comes to just me being having conversations with certain people. I think about, when I was younger, I didn't want to do this or I didn't want to ask this question or I phrased this question a certain way because of what I learned growing up. And just this idea of being a product of your environment as a negative thing, I think it goes beyond just that particular connotation because we really have an opportunity to reshape a narrative. And I think that's essentially what Nipsey was doing with everything that he was doing. And honestly, when we go back to this idea that there's an obligation, I think to me it's a personal obligation. We personally make that decision because ultimately, if I don't do it, who else will?
Right.
In the end, the way black people have been treated in society is as a result of all the things that we've historically been through, all the things that we historically weren't exposed to, all the things that we weren't allowed to learn. Right. Because we have to consistently remind ourselves that there was a point that they wouldn't allow us to read. And if this is going to start another conversation, if we were allowed to read, we were only allowed to read the Bible.
Right.
And we had to teach it a certain way. And we had to do certain things as a result of that. So when we talk about this obligation, to me personally, yes, there is an obligation to give back. And there's definitely ways for you to do that. And you, again, have to even further have a conversation. Well, how much is it? Am I risking for me personally? And how much is it where does that risk outweigh this idea that there is an obligation to give back and do certain things for their community? So I think that's a discussion, a conversation that must be had. Like, how much am I willing to risk? And at what point is that risk going to outweigh this idea that, you know, my personal security is worth more than, or this, not even worth more, but this, how much am I willing to put up to fulfill this obligation?
All right. Well, I mean, let's kind of take that, if you will, because this is the part that I think is crazy about it. Is there are so many things. Let's take, for instance, an athlete, right? Mm-hmm. Because athletes generally get branded a little bit more than music artists.
For sure.
You know, at least in my opinion. I'm not, I don't have any statistics behind it, but it seems like when I turn on the TV, I see more athletes than I do see entertainers promoting products.
I think that's a fair statement, even without statistics.
Okay. So let's take an athlete that comes from an inner city, and now he's on, right? And now he's the face of Adidas or Nike or whatever, face of whatever it is. Now that he's a brand, he's also he may have his own brand, his or her own brand, but now he's also a representative of this quote unquote mainstream product. Mm-hmm. And what happens is those people in control of those mainstream products don't want you to appear or look like or behave or whatever whatever the conversation is, like the folks where you came from. They want you to be completely different because they need to make you digestible in other, or palatable in other mm-hmm. households, right? And so then in those scenarios, the ability to give back is now being balanced against this check that you need, right. Or maybe not even need, because very well paid mm-hmm. athletes, but this check that you have the availability to have. And at that point, what ends up happening is the only way that they feel comfortable, I would think, to give back is through some charity organization or football camp, or mm-hmm. going down and handing out shoes, or whatever it is. It's not that it's a meaningless gesture, but it doesn't really create that infrastructure similar to what Nipsey was trying to promote that creates change in those communities. Because if I can tell you, every neighborhood that I lived in from birth, well, I can't say birth, I didn't remember that, but from maybe my first memories, maybe being like 3, 4, 5 years old, to being out and being able to observe my world,
right,
up until the time that I left San Diego, all liquor stores, that's if I need to get bread, milk, whatever else, liquor store, crackhead, graffiti on the wall, gang member, all the shit. Every boys in the hood story, every neighborhood I lived in, bouncing around as a kid, had that same element.
Right.
So when you start talking about giving back, it's hard to say what these people are going to do when they give back in the way that they're going to give back. Because what we have, when you have a liquor store there, they're not owned by blacks, and they're poisoning the community, but on the same note, they're offering what they call convenience stores, because
mm-hmm.
they're making it convenient for people who may not be able to go here, there, wherever,
right,
to get access to certain things. But it's not like Whole Foods type food, mm-hmm. It's like the cheapest thing,
right,
the poorest quality thing, old, stale. 99-cent stores. Like, it's like, this is what's being thrown here. So when you have people that are giving back, how are they going to give back without contributing to the poisoning of a neighborhood unless they're willing to take an actual loss, of financial loss, by putting in things that are good for the people but bad for them from a business standpoint? Like, you put in, let's say, a grocery store that sells organic foods and things like that. Well, you have to sell them at cost, damn near, to make them affordable to the people that live there, but you still have overhead, so you're doing it and it becomes a money pit for you. So that doesn't really become an opportunity. So how do you really kind of give back and not sink with the ship at the same time? That's a question I pose.
Man, there's a lot within that, because at the end of the day, that becomes more of a charitable thing for you.
Right.
And this idea that you're willing to risk losing money in order for you to give that charity back to your community. So ultimately, to your point, how you give back, to me, in Nip's situation, he was comfortable with that idea. You know, I don't know particularly whether, you know, he was losing money or not, but
I don't think he was.
I'm certain he was comfortable with this idea, because his idea of giving back was having that store within his community where he grew up, where he was told he wasn't welcome when he was younger. He could have opened a store anywhere. He could have opened a store, you know, around the corner from here. He could have opened a store downtown LA. He could have opened a store in West Hollywood, but he chose his community where he grew up for a particular reason. And I think this idea exists that he wanted to build something more. He wanted to show people that there was more to be had. And in order for him to do that, he was willing to go back and do certain things within his community and obviously show face, even knowing that people could potentially have it out for him.
Well, you know, the crazy part, man, is we bring up the money aspect, but that ends up being the prime motivator in a lot of this stuff. And not for him necessarily, but like, even when people go in and start gobbling up property, like, I've seen it. I've represented like landlords, you know, and they'll go in and buy these complexes, these buildings, these houses in low-income neighborhoods. Then they try to, you know, I guess, refurbish them in a way, make them better, raise the rent, and figure out a way to get these people out.
Gentrification.
100%. And so, you know, in order for you to kind of stop something like that, if you are an entertainer, a black entertainer, or just a person with the means,
you have to own.
But this is what I'm saying. This is where the dilemma becomes. This is where you find that dilemma, because let's just say I work hard, I bust my ass, I make enough to be able to purchase in my own neighborhood where I grew up.
Yep.
And then I purchase, and when you make a certain amount of money, you usually got an accountant, so somebody's telling you what you should and shouldn't be doing with your money, right? And then they tell you, and they run down the books, and look how much money you're losing. If you did this, your profits could be here. And so now you're put in this position where other people don't necessarily have to be put in that position because they don't have that obligation. But now you're put in a position that if you want to help your community, you have to be willing to take that financial hit. Because either, and don't let it be like a dilapidated building where it's just like it needs all sorts of remodeling.
Right.
Because then if you do remodel, that's you putting the money in, and most people remodel because they know that they're going to get the money back.
Right.
But if you remodel and you raise the rent, you're doing no different than anybody else. So that ownership doesn't necessarily benefit the community. So it really does end up being a scenario for us that when we give back in ways that are meaningful, it comes at a tremendous, tremendous price in order for it to be, I guess, beneficial to a community as a whole.
Yeah. And, you know, we could talk about this all day. And I think one of the points I want to make is oftentimes you're not appreciated during the time in which you should be, but also you're not appreciated where you're from in many cases. I was listening to an interview with Lil Boosie a while back, and one of the points that he made was many of the rappers that you see who are taken away, who are murdered, are often murdered within their own communities, and I think there's evidence to that point with some of the recent deaths that we've had. I can't remember the rapper's name off the top of my head, but I think he was from either Alabama or Arkansas, but he died where he was from. And obviously, Nipsey died basically where he spent the majority of his life.
Right.
So I just think we need to really do whatever possible to shift that narrative, and for people who, and I believe, at least I would hope that there's rappers out there who truly are following the same path that Nipsey is. And so as a society, I think the onus is on us to figure out who those people are and promote them more.
Yeah, 100%.
And with that, I guess the question I'd like to pose is like, what's next for us? How do we honor the legacy of Nipsey Hussle?
All right. Honestly, before I take that on, I think I want to just go back for a second to something you said about rappers dying, like in these situations that they come from, and it's really, really difficult, I think, to kind of wrap your head around in a way, because the very thing that made them is kind of what they have to maintain and sustain in order to keep that popularity and to keep that influence, right? Because there are other people who invest in the community that are not known because they're not musicians. They're just behind the scenes. They could be a doctor. They could just be, a financial analyst, like whatever it is that, and they're just out there investing, however that is. But for someone who comes up in that neighborhood, if you end up being a rapper, 9 times out of 10, you're going to rap about the stuff that you saw.
Absolutely.
And if you pick up and move to the suburbs and do anything else, your career is pretty much over, because no one wants to hear from you anymore because you're not from there anymore. Yeah. So it's crazy, because they have to stay, in order to maintain the credibility and still be able to produce and be in a position to have that influence to then make change. But on the same note, they're also in an environment where it becomes easier to fall victim to a senseless killing like this, because that's the environment. Yeah. Like Nipsey wasn't the only person that got killed that day in that neighborhood, I'm certain. He won't be the last. It's happened days before, it happened days after. And it's tragic because of what he meant and what he was going to do, and his vision and his plan, and how it might effectuate change down the line. Right. But the hard part is, in order for him to be in that position, he had to remain involved. I don't mean like gang involvement.
No, I know exactly
what I'm saying. But like, he had to remain involved in that community, and by doing that, it allowed him to be exposed to people who, man, I remember him when he was just this, he was just that. Like, that jealousy becomes so much greater, right? And the target becomes so much bigger, and it's a vicious cycle when it comes to that aspect in my mind. But sorry, I didn't want to go off on that tangent.
Oh no, you're like right along the lines of kind of what ultimately we need to be talking about. Because honestly, we should be having, and when I say we, I don't mean you and I mean just the community at large, needs to be having a deeper discussion, deeper conversation on how we can deal with the root of this issue. Yeah. Because it goes beyond just this idea that gangs are within this community.
Right.
Gangs begin as a result of something else, as a result of not being able to provide, or not having that sense of community, not being connected, not having opportunities, not having resources. Like, we can go on and on.
Right.
But it all stems from something, and in order to deal with what comes as a result of that, is we need to understand where the root of this tree is coming from, and again, have a deeper discussion and engage in a different way to sort of build the communities that promote people who are trying to do something different, and to create opportunities and develop resources to combat things that allow these things to happen. But again, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, it made me think, I mean, do you think that, or do you worry that what happened to Nipsey will serve as inspiration, or will it serve as a deterrent to other rappers who want to follow in his footsteps? Because that would be my, it's a tragedy that he passed, especially in the way that he passed. The bigger tragedy is that if it turns off anybody who was set to follow in his footsteps, because they don't want to lose their life. They're afraid that this could be them. Yeah. And maybe they should just go make music and be happy.
I mean, I think that exists. Certainly. Interestingly enough, I posted something similar because to what I was saying earlier, I believe everything that I've talked about doing personally was everything that Nip was doing. And, that the risk that exists, you have to determine if it's greater than your obligation and what you're willing to sacrifice in order to create that. And to that point, I believe it will inspire people. At least that's what I hope to actually do things necessary to create change. Because Nipsey was inspired by somebody. He was inspired by Tupac. Right. And you hear rappers, of course, like Kendrick, like J. Cole, all people who are actually trying to do and speak about something different. You hear them talking about that today.
Right.
They were inspired. So at least my hope is that people will see this and aspire to do exactly what Nip had a goal to do. And I think we're having different conversations within the community right now. I saw a meeting between, I believe it was a set of Bloods and a set of Crips yesterday.
Several sets.
Several sets.
Yeah.
And they were just engaged in conversation, talking about how they can have a peace treaty during this time at least. And I think it's opening up the doors to have several different conversations. And I think people will see this as we need to be doing something different, and we need to engage our community in a different way to create a different story, to create a different narrative. And, to the question that I posed a little bit earlier, I think those are some of the ways we can honor his legacy. Go in and own property. Go in and promote the people who need to be promoted and do something different within our communities to sort of develop that prosperity and wealth that Nip had a goal to do.
Yeah, and I agree with you, man. When you talk about what's next, I think it really is, number one, creating more exposure for the things that he did for people like me who did not even realize the depth of his involvement. Mm-hmm. And again, like I said, I don't know how much of a minority I'm in for not knowing this stuff, but creating that exposure, promoting that, and then for people who have the means and the ability to do something similar, to get out there and do it. And then for his own, the things that he had already, whatever foundations he had already started, to support those so that they don't fall to the wayside because he's no longer here. I'm sure his wife will take care of that, but it's going to still require support from others. So to support things like that, and then just start trying to create a blueprint. Like, I don't know, because I'm not in that industry, I don't know how many people take on and have mentors, but I know in other industries that's the way it works, right? In other industries, there's someone who's been doing this 10, 20 years longer than you, that has achieved so much more than you, and they're telling you the way that they got to theirs so that you can skip several other steps that they failed. Right. And I wonder if there is this same idea in rap or in hip-hop culture where the entertainers are taking someone and saying, this is the way you do it. Yep. This is what I did. And I wish when I was your age, I would have known this. And people were accepting that and using that. Because you're starting to hear so much more of this, people owning their masters. I know you mentioned Nipsey he owned his, I think, what is it, 2 Chainz, either recently acquired his or he already had it.
Chris Brown did as well.
So it starts there. It starts there, and it also starts with having people that you trust being involved in the contracts and making sure that you're not being taken advantage of so that you are in a position to own. Because all of that really means is more revenue, and hopefully you have what it takes to realize that I can only do so much personally with this money.
Yep.
And now I need to divert it into ways that help build, an infrastructure that continues to build upon itself.
One final thing I wanted to sort of call out really quick. One word you said was blueprint.
Yes, sir.
And automatically I thought about Jay. So, of course, he's doing a lot of what we've talked about.
Yes.
Not only for himself, but, I feel like we see a story every week of somebody he's trying to help. Like, I think Lil Uzi is having an issue with his record company or record label right now, so Jay is trying to help with that. Jay helped Meek Mill when it came to him being in jail. So I think right now I'm interested to see what Jay does. And we need to be mindful that is somebody who is trying to change the conversation. That's somebody who's trying to, do something different, create something different, regardless of where he came from. Because if you listen to Jay enough, in any song that he has, Jay came from
Marcy Projects.
Marcy Projects. He came up as a dope dealer, and he's literally shifted his entire life to create something different. So, again, I'm interested to see what he does next, because I don't know everything that Jay does, and I don't know what his goals are and how he's making his moves, but I just want to see what happens next with him. And I think there was a story recently which they determined wasn't true, that Jay started some trust fund for Nipsey's kids or something like that, which they determined that wasn't the case. But again, I'm just interested to see what he does next.
Yeah, that is interesting. And one of the things that's funny is, like, if you follow his music from the beginning to the 444 album and the stuff that he talked about there, it's
completely different.
Completely different. But the funniest part about it is, I wonder how many people are listening to the 444 album and saying, damn, you're right. Or how many are saying, this dude's old and washed.
Right.
What is he talking about? And
right.
I think that's really the disconnect. The reason I think Nipsey was so potentially influential is because he was still in that age bracket.
Yep.
He was, 32, 33?
33, yep.
Yeah, so he was still in that age bracket where his voice carried some weight, whereas Jay was just like an old head. Like I think I told you this story before when I was a kid, when Tupac was going at Dolores Tucker and back and forth. like I was on Tupac's side because it was just like,
right.
That was my age range. Like, that's who I connected with. Now I'm old. I don't like to hear the B word. I don't like to hear the N word. Like, I see I look at them differently now than I did back then.
Right.
And I'm sure people are going to see that differently until they reach a certain age and maturity where it makes sense to them. So I just wonder if there's somebody who's as young and connected as Nipsey that's ready to pick up that mantle and run with it.
Yeah, we'll see. I think to your point that younger people aren't listening to Jay. I know for sure Lonzo Ball doesn't listen to Nas. He made it a point to say that pretty recently, I think sometime last year. But anyway, I know we've talked about it over the past couple of episodes, but we do, speaking of our obligation, to have an opportunity to include different voices, even besides our own. And we've tried to do that in different ways in terms of having, tweets and stuff ready to have discussions about certain things, whatever it may be. But again, I think, our goal over the past couple of weeks has been just really to take some time and just think about what we're doing in terms of the direction we want to sort of develop for the show. I think we've done so much in terms of having conversations and opening our own eyes in terms of what we read and what we, sort of talk about. But, there's opportunity, obviously, to do more. So, again, I'd say all of that to say, as we have these conversations, make sure you continue to share what you think is important to have a conversation about with us, whether it be on social media or if you are connected to us, where you can call us, definitely do that. Yeah. Hopefully we're able to engage you guys in a different way and have deeper discussions, and of course have more people on to the show to talk.
Yeah, I mean, that's the main part. We want to get some different viewpoints. So
it's coming. That's all I can say. It's coming, and I think as we've taken the time to like sort of take the past couple weeks off in terms of putting the show out there, it's allowed us to have opportunity to think and figure out ways we're going to do that. So again, it's coming. We appreciate all of you guys who continue to listen to us and be patient with us as we figure this whole thing out, because I think that's ultimately what's happening. Yeah, it's certainly a process. So again, definitely honored to be able to have this conversation, and I think there's a much larger obligation that we have moving forward, and we need to be mindful, we need to be aware of what that entails, and we need to continue to have discussions and take the necessary action to make this larger. And when I say make this larger, I don't mean the podcast. I mean this idea about having the conversations that we need to have in terms of ownership, in terms of creating different conversations about things that are happening within our community and what we need to do to sort of combat some of those issues. But with that said, this is the Sounding Black Podcast. I'm Till.
And I'm Will.
Sounding off.